understand what their request is, making sure they followed our instructions, and just making sure we're on the same page. As I'm sure you all know, later this week we'll have the economic outlook, the revenue forecast, and then the Medicaid forecast on Wednesday. And then just to mention here, the statutory deadline for the submission of the governor's budget to the State Budget Committee is by the third Monday in January. That third Monday is January 18th, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and so practically I assume we're talking about presenting the governor's budget back to this body sometime the week of January 11th through 14th, just noting that it's probably sometime between that Monday and Thursday. Regarding the details of budget development, we started off by asking every state agency to trim their base request by 15%. And just to say that a little bit differently, whatever their FY21 appropriation was, we asked them to reduce that starting point by 15%. And as you'll see, some of them did that and kind of stuck with that as their overall request, and you'll see several agencies that asked for some or all of that 15% reduction back as part of their final budget submission. And just to note that 15% reduction, we did not apply that to any of our pension contributions, didn't apply that to the Medicaid appropriation, didn't apply it to tuition support, the main way that we fund K through 12, did not apply it to universities. In all, that 15% base reduction resulted in lowering the budget request, the overall budget request, by about $665 million. And the reason for that, kind of next couple bullets here, is just going into this process, we have assumed that the FY22 revenue levels would be roughly $500 million less than what the appropriations were for this fiscal year. And then for 23, we've just assumed that roughly, give or take $100 million, those revenues for FY23 would be within the 21 appropriation level. I think this pie chart, and I hope it clear enough to see, but I think this kind of puts really good context just in terms of how things look. So the general fund budget for FY21 is this $17.5 billion number. And just as we've been managing this year, as we've been thinking about building the budget for the next 2 years, the largest piece on the side there, the tuition support, then the slice next to that, the teacher retirement fund contributions, and then Medicaid, and then higher education. And so when I did the math the other day, I think that adds up to like 69%, the blue through the yellow. And so just kind of putting in context in terms of when we were calculating this base reduction of 15%, we really only applied it to that to the third, or a little bit less than a third. That's the lighter blue, with the other education up through the very top, where kind of you see distributions and transportation getting like less than a percent. But in terms of budget development, we held harmless kind of the tuition support, teacher retirement, Medicaid, and that higher education chunk. Just to remind you guys what the deliverables are, in terms of the budget report that we're required to submit to Budget Committee by that third Monday. That includes a statement of budget and fiscal policy, a summary of expenditures, revenues, essentially the surplus statement, 2 years of historical spending, current year spending and revenue, and then proposed spending and revenue for the next 2 years. And that gets into a second, when I walk you guys through the O1A, a lot of that information is kind of in that format. A description of the capital improvement program, the budget bill is part of the budget report, and then a tax expenditure report. I think that's an LSA requirement. And then a summary and justification for workforce-related programs in the recommended budget. And then again, just a reminder that the report that we finally put together not only looks at general fund, but also dedicated funds and federal funds. I just want to mention a few of the challenges that I know we're going to be working on through budget development. The first one is the Tobacco Master Settlement Fund. And so, I think a lot of you are aware of this, but just to make sure, with the ACA, the state has been benefiting from an enhanced FMAP for our CHIP program for several years, and that enhanced FMAP has been winding down. And so the state's contribution towards CHIP for our share of that, I think if you look back 2 years ago, and again, it's been shifting over time, so it's probably easier if I just explain where it was to where it's going to be once this is all said and done. For the last few years, we've been at like about 1.6 million, 1.7 million being the state's contribution. By the time we get into next fiscal year, that is going to increase by almost exactly 50 million. The state's contribution with the lower FMAP is going to be approximately 52 or 53 million. And so the way the Tobacco Master Settlement Fund has been structured so far, we're just not in a position to absorb that increase. And so we'll be talking about how do we shift some things out of maybe the Tobacco Master Settlement Fund, or just kind of restructure some of those things. And most likely we'll have to look at probably taking some of these portions and shifting them back to the general fund, or lowering those appropriations. Obviously, COVID-19 is going to continue to present some challenges. What are those ongoing costs going to be? And then, if and when will the federal government provide more COVID-19 related funding? Clearly, protecting our K through 12 funding and university funding is going to be critical. And as that chart showed, that pie graph on the previous page, that represents a little bit more than half of our entire general fund budget. And then obviously revenue uncertainty going to be another challenge that we work through. Last thing on here, and again, I hope that appears clearly enough. I just want to kind of walk you guys through the 01A document, the report. Technically, it's the 001A, but I get used to calling it just the 01A. Hyperion is our budget development system, but this is Department of Revenue's request. They're presenting later today, and while there's some big dollars here, they're probably set up about easier than any other state government or other state agency, just in terms of how they're funded. What you can see here is those first two columns, the actual 19 and the actual FY20. Those are the actual expenses out of the accounting system for this agency. They have 3 funds that they tend to spend money out of. That top one is their main operating, that collection administration. They have another fund called outside collections, and then the last one here is their motor carrier regulation fund. And you can see this is set up as general fund, and that motor carrier is dedicated fund appropriations. But again, we have 2 years of historical spending information, the 19 and 20 columns, and then the next 2 columns represent this current year. And so one is the 21 appropriation. How much did the General Assembly appropriate to them this year? The next column is their current year estimate or spending plan. What are they expecting to spend this year? The next column is the base, and so I think we had great participation among state agencies, and so in almost every instance, you'll see that the base should be 15% less than that 21 appropriation number. Now, what you might recognize in some of these is that we try not to micromanage the agencies in terms of how they go about this. And so some have calculated their base on a line-by-line basis, so each individual line is reduced by 15%. And other agencies have taken an approach that, hey, this program is more valuable than this program, and so maybe I'm taking 30% off of this one and only 0% off of this one, just assuming that the appropriations were the same amount. I think in this instance, Department of Revenue took a 15% off of each line approach. After the base, you have the requests for 22 and 23. In a lot of instances, those numbers will be exactly the same. If they are different, that means that there's been a change package request. Usually change package just implies that there's a difference there. As you would expect, most change packages are positive and not negative. But in this example, you can see that the Department of Revenue has kept their budget flat for 22 compared to the base, but they did request a change package of approximately $5 million for the second year. As they give their presentation, you'll hear that with ITS coming online after they've built out the system, just ongoing costs to maintain that new system. But anyway, that's just the report. The bottom here you can see summarizes the general fund, the dedicated, and then the total. The one thing that this one does not represent are transfers. And so in some of these other reports, you'll see where transfer lines are in there. And that is simply where dollars are appropriated in one section, but they are being moved over and spent out of another line. And so a good example of that might be a program. Let's use Medicaid as an example, where we appropriate money for the general fund for Medicaid, but they end up transferring it to a federal fund where it gets spent out. And so that on the Medicaid line, for example, you would see the source of funding there as a transfer, when they're spending it out of their federal fund. But that's the end of my short presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Mr. Jackson? Thank you. Yes, Senator Melton.
Just two quick questions. Thank you for your presentation.
My pleasure.
On slide 7, for the COVID-19 piece, we say what are the ongoing costs, and this is for budget challenges. If and when will the federal government provide more COVID-19 related funding? I was just curious in terms of the existing funding, has that been considered or in this budget planning process, and what's the strategy for that? And my second question would be protecting K through 12 funding. Is there a scenario where, based off budget projections or revenue forecast projections, where that would not be protected? So those are the two questions I have.
Sure. So regarding the COVID-19 funding, I would suggest, so on Wednesday, as part of the business meeting, my boss, Chris Johnson, the OMB director, will be providing an update on kind of COVID-19 funding that we've spent to date, just where we're at there, balances. I know we're closely watching the federal government and hoping for, if either an extension of existing funding or more funding, but he'll have a lot more information in his presentation on Wednesday. And regarding the protecting K through 12 and university funding, as I'm looking at the numbers, I don't see a scenario where we would need to reduce funding. Certainly, I'm not sure that anybody's ready to increase funding, but I don't think there's any existing fundings in jeopardy at this point. I do know regarding, and again, we're talking about building the budget, not so much how we manage this year. I am hearing regarding kind of how ADM counts are going this year, that we're likely to have some sort of some substantial reversion of those dollars this year, where just the formula does not distribute all of those dollars, but that's not due to trying to manage the situation or anything like that. Just I think I've heard a number of I think 14,000 kids not coming back this year compared to what was estimated whenever the education funding formula was put together.
Ms. Hamilton.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Zach, for your presentation. One question also on slide 7.
Yep.
You talked about the increased FMAP going away for CHIP, and I'm just not being super familiar with that program. Is there any concern that there'll be changes in eligibility or cost to families that take advantage of that program?
I don't think so. So CHIP is the Children's Health Insurance Program, much like traditional Medicaid, just it's got a higher poverty requirement compared to normal Medicaid. I haven't looked in a while, but it's something around the 200% poverty level, FPL. And I think in terms of the contributions from the family or anything like that, I think are, I want to say zero, but don't hold me to that. That it's very low. If there is any financial participation on their part of the family in terms of co-pays or anything like that. I think they're fairly minimal. But no, I don't think we're expecting any increased challenges there. With CHIP, we already have a slightly enhanced FMAP. So normally I think about our Medicaid FMAP being the feds paying approximately 2/3 and the state paying 1/3. I want to say and I'll look at Joe to see if he can help me out here. I want to say CHIP normally has something like a 70 or 75%. Yeah, 75%. So already CHIP has a higher FMAP than normal, but under the ACA, it was pushing like 99%. And now with that kind of rolling back to the 75%, over about like 2 years or so, that's where we're getting from this, where we were only paying $1.7 million a year. Our share is going from 1% to 25%, and that's what's going to cost us about $50 million more to keep that going.
50 or 15?
50.
Okay, thanks.
Representative Porter.
I'll get you the exact amount. Yeah.
It's a little complex for us just because it's on the federal fiscal year, not the state fiscal year, and so it overlaps more state fiscal years than just I think from a federal standpoint, it was being reduced over 2 fiscal years, but I think that impacts 3 fiscal years for the state.
Senator Brown.
That's right. It's been kind of rolling down over about 2 years. We've known all along. Yep.
Thank you. Any further questions? Thank you very much. Next, we have Mr. Russo with Indiana Public Retirement System, NPERS.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Steve Russo. I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Public Retirement System. Happy to be with you here today on behalf of the Board of Trustees and our 200 employees working hard every day to take care of our members. I'm going to move very quickly today. In your packet is, I call it 76, maybe 75 slides of pension fund. I'm going to take a breath at about slide 12 for time to take any questions, and depending upon your questions, can dig deeper as needed. But just a reminder about us in that as of the last fiscal year closed, we had $36.9 billion in assets. I have to report that probably as of the end of last week, we actually probably crossed the $40 billion threshold for the first time in our history, given the strong positive market returns of this fiscal year so far. We serve the retirement needs of 467,000 members and serve more than 1,200 employers. Our portfolio of funds that we manage has grown over the years. We are now up to 16 different funds that we manage. We have 8 different defined benefit funds, 5 defined contribution funds, 2 non-retirement funds, and 1 OPEB called REMBA that used to be referred to as the State 501 plan that transitioned to us last fiscal year. I will make a note that There is a plan for us to take over the administration of the Governor's and Surviving Spouses Pension Fund, a very small plan that is currently administered by the Auditor of State. We will take over the administration via MOU to them on January 1st. However, there is pending possible legislation in the NPERS bill that was presented to the Pension Management Oversight Committee that would actually transfer the assets and permanently move the management of that fund over to NPERS. So just to take a quick snapshot of the last fiscal year, if I could only say one thing and one thing today, it would be the statement that our pension plans remain well-funded. And given what has happened thus far, we expect no employer contribution rate increases through at least the year 2022. I'll talk in a moment about the pressures that might be building up with our assumed rate of return that might place some pressures on those contribution rates in the future. But given the timing and the lag that takes place, our board just adopted contribution rates out of the most recent numbers this past October, and those are the rates that effectively go into place through the year 2022. So any further board action wouldn't be out until the year 2023. Overall, believe it or not, good news in that the estimated aggregate funded status of all of what we call our pre-funded plans, which is almost all of our plans except for the teacher pre-96, increased from roughly 88% to close to 91%. And the story behind that is that in any one given year you have, I'll call it pluses and minuses that happened. I'll talk in a moment about every 5 years we do a thing called an actuarial experience study. And the results of that were actually a positive to the liabilities, brought them down. So that helped reduce the liabilities and the unfunded liability. We have a funding policy in place that strives to pay what the actuaries say is minimum, but also bring stability and predictability to what our employers have to pay. And so because of the mechanisms of that, we brought in a little bit more incremental contributions from our employers than what the actuaries had said. So those two positives were offset, though, by a slightly less than expected investment return over a 5-year time horizon. The actuaries average investment returns over 5 years. And so when you think of the total context of that, the two good things far outdid us in terms of the one negative thing, which resulted in that increase in our overall funded status. The teacher pre-96 plan remains stable. Its unfunded liabilities actually went down slightly to $10.3 billion, still a lot of money. And I'll show you a chart here in a moment that shows you kind of what the forecasted liabilities and payments are of that plan. So I'll talk a moment about this actuarial experience study. As I mentioned before, we routinely go back and look at all of our assumptions at least every 5 years. I will note, however, that every year the actuaries actually compare person by person what they assumed to what actually happened. So every year we recognize what's called an experience gain or a loss. But every 5 years, though, we go back and look, okay, hey, based on the last 5 years and what actually happened, does that warrant a change going forward into what we think will happen? And so we just recently completed that study. A full report of that is available on our website. But I would just say the major probably headline that moved the numbers the most across most of the plans had to do with mortality. There was some recent work that was done that looked at mortality within government sector workers. That was done nationally. And so we were able to take advantage of that. And we're big enough that we're actually able to look at mortality experience within our plans to reconcile the differences between what's seen nationally and what we see here in Indiana, which allows our actuaries to do very accurate estimates of that. I say the good news is for the retirement fund is that from a mortality perspective in general, people are not expected to live as long as we thought. So if you're the pension fund, that's a good thing because it reduces how much payments we think that we're going to make over time, which reduces our liabilities. Obviously, to the individual, that may not be the case. So overall, that reduced our liabilities on the order, and I'll have a chart here in a moment, but with everything else all said and done, by close to $1 billion. But I do want to make mention that in addition to every 5 years of doing an actuarial experience study, we do this other thing called an asset liability study. And this is the exercise that is the major guidance to how we will invest our money going forward and what rate of return we expect from those investments going forward. And that rate of return assumption is a key driver in the calculation of the liabilities in our plans. That work is now back, I'll call it re-underway. We were in the middle of it when COVID hit. A lot of volatility and uncertainty in what was going into markets, so we thought it was prudent to take a breather, let things settle out before we dove back in. And so we're in the process of doing that now. However, I guess today I kind of want to set that expectation to everyone that everything that we're seeing is that seems to be a consensus that the rate of return forecast are trending down for just about every asset class. So we will expect to see the results of our study come May of next year. But I can tell you today that the scenarios that we're currently working on and looking in, today we have a 6.75% return assumption. But I would say the scenarios that we're realistically looking at today lie between 6 and 6.5. This next slide is an eye chart that gets down into the granularity of each of the individual funds and how their funded status has changed from last fiscal year to this current fiscal year. As I noted earlier, on aggregate, the funded status going up, but I can tell you each one of these plans has their own unique story that's driven by their demographics and the actual experiences that they've had within them in terms of how and when people retire. And so there's a slight variance to the impact of each of the individual funds. And due to time constraints here today, I won't go into any of those individual circumstances, but just to highlight a couple things in that the Teacher 96 Fund, which there was action taken back in FY19 to transfer $150 million of incremental appropriations to top that fund up over to 100% to be able to bring the contribution that schools have to pay into that. So that took that fund over 100% at the time, and even with what happened last year, that fund remains over 100% at 100.9%. A slide that we've added into the deck to try to give perspective to pensions, because it really is a longer-term game rather than just showing you what happens year over year. What we've attempted to do in this slide is show you what the projected funded status is in aggregate of those of all of our plans, including the Teacher Pre-96 plan, as time goes by. And so as you can see, we start to march up the curve to about 2030 when in aggregate we would forecast reaching 90.5%. One of the big drivers of that is because as this time goes by, you have the legacy Teacher Pre-96 plan, and its liabilities and payments will start to go down as members age out of that plan. And so then you have the healthy Pre-96 plan becoming bigger and more prominent. So that's one of the biggest drivers of that increase over time. This next slide I use just as a reminder. It was an eye-opener to me several years ago in some respects, but I think important for this body, in that what we attempt to show here is the share of the liabilities as well as where the money comes from, split between the state and local units of government. In 2017, there was a crossover in which the local units of government in aggregate now own a majority of the liabilities across all of our plans. So you could say the state is now a minority holder of those liabilities across all the plans. And I say that just because as a lot of most, if not all, of the policy and the benefits that are provided across our plans are done here. And just a reminder that as you decide to take upon any changes to any of these plans, that it's not just an impact to the state, but it's also an impact to local units of government. However, because of the nature of where the teacher pre-96 fund is, and the state obviously pays all the bills for that at the moment, the state still is a majority owner, I'll call it, of paying in the dollars on an annual basis at this point. But that will also cross over into the future as the teacher pre-96 plan winds down. This is what we call the hump chart for the teacher pre-96 plan. What this represents is the curve represents each year the total amount of money going out the door to pay benefits in this plan. This plan is established as what's called as a pay-as-you-go plan. So that hump represents the payments going out the door. The blue represents, of those payments for that in one given year, how much is being paid by state appropriations. And then the red represents how much is being paid out of the Pension Stabilization Fund, which is a base of assets that was set aside a number of years ago and received contributions, still continues to receive a lottery contribution today, and is invested to grow over time. And so the key mechanics of this plan really haven't changed in most recent years. The benefit payments in this plan will peak out at around 2026, 2027. There's a little bit of, I'll call it choppiness here from year to year in the actuals, because the numbers can change a little bit based on how many teachers actually decide to retire that year, what the mortality actually is that year. But my actuaries say, you know, more or less, we're now in that 5-year window of hitting that peak of the payments that will be going out to those members before we start to gradually go down. And as depicted in this chart, we continue to forecast and assume that we will see 3% year-over-year growth in the appropriations to support that plan, until which time it becomes 100% funded, which is now forecasted in the 2037, 2038 timeframe. And then you have a steep, obviously, decline in that blue, because that's the point at which it comes fully funded, and the forecast goes as planned, which it probably won't, but in the forecast as it's projected here, right, appropriations go from something around 900 million down to 0. I know there's been ongoing discussions, and probably will continue to be, about maybe, you know, what if anything is done maybe to smooth out that so there isn't that cliff out there, but this is what our current projections are based on. This next slide just kind of puts into numbers what the last picture showed in terms of what the actual benefit payments have been in that plan, what the forecasts are for this fiscal year and over the next budget cycle. Then you can then see what we've requested and assumed for appropriations, and then based on that, how much has to get withdrawn from the Pension Stabilization Fund, and with all the other ins and outs of that fund, what the projected balance, and this chart's called the net position, but that's effectively what is the balance of what's called the Pension Stabilization Fund, which is going to be hovering here around $3.7 billion, more or less, over the next few years. The last major fund I wanted to talk about, because today I'm focusing on those funds that drive the state appropriations, is a fund called the Local Public Safety Pension Relief Fund. And this is a fund that was established a number of years back. This was part of property tax reform, in which the liabilities for all of the legacy public safety plans that existed across the state of Indiana that predated the creation of the 77 fund, those liabilities and the payments for those plans, or I should say the payments for those plans, moved over to the state. And so MPERS plays a role in which we collect all the actuarial information and all the details from each of the employers that have those plans, and do forecast of what it is that is needed to make those benefit payments, which then translates to what then we will forecast that the state needs to appropriate to support those payments. And that's what's reflected in here. And essentially you see that you know, we're at that point in this plan, we're at about 145 million, wanting to bump up slightly to 150 to 155 million over the next budget cycle to support that plan. I don't have it in this slide deck, but this is another plan just because of the demographics of it that over the coming decades will become smaller and smaller. This last eye chart here summarizes across all the different plans the funding sources, and attempted kind of for the purposes here today to break this out between what is directly appropriated in the state budget versus those monies that come from other places. And so as you can see, as you go down through the general fund appropriation column, the biggest one being the teacher pre-96 plan, followed by then second, which is towards the bottom, the pension relief fund at 155 million. And then if you go back up towards the top, you have several of the other smaller plans, the judges and the prosecutors, which are paid by direct appropriations from the state budget at much relatively smaller dollar amounts. So move beyond the numbers, just to quickly talk about how we're doing operationally. We are participants in a global survey benchmarking exercise that's done by an independent firm out of Canada called CEM. They benchmark pension plans across the world. They also then create custom peer groups of funds that are most similar to us, which in this case would be funds in the United States that have a mix of defined benefit and defined contribution of our approximate size of assets and members. And we get a multi-inch report from them every year. But one slide that summarizes best is that one of the key parameters that they measure systems by is both their service and their cost. And so they assign a service score, and then they do the math of what is your cost to administer the plans divided by the number of members, your cost per member. And so this is a quadrant chart in which one would strive to be in the upper left, because that would mean relative to peers that you are higher in service and lower in cost than the universe of all the people they benchmark. And so on this chart, what we've attempted to do in the bigger colored boxes is show the progression of NPERS up through that over time, going back to FY13, shortly after we had merged into a single consolidated system. And we're proud and happy to report that each year consecutively, we've been able to reduce our cost per member while at the same time increasing our service score. The last slide before I take a breather and take any questions, just talk briefly about COVID-19 and its impacts to us. The key thing is that all benefit payments and benefit applications have been processed and taken place as scheduled. The team has done a phenomenal job. All in-person service volume essentially migrated to virtual options that already existed prior to the pandemic, so we were well positioned. We had all the virtual alternatives in place for people to do what they needed to do. So it was just migrating resources and moving capacity from one channel to another. Our call center service levels were on average maintained. However, I will say though that depending upon maybe the time during the pandemic, the day of the week, some members may have experienced some longer call times than what we had wanted, just because it was a very different now pattern of when people were calling in. There's a lot of science that goes into predicting call volumes, and when you need to have so many people on the phone at any one time, when that workforce moved out of the office and into their homes, that completely changed a lot of those models. And so we had to take some time to adjust to be sure that we had the right number of people on the phones at the right times. The call center work also is a type of work that is, I would say, a little bit less flexible due to an individual circumstance. There's a lot of the work that we do within the system that could probably be done in the middle of the night by that individual. And We've had members, due to flexibilities and family circumstances, go above and beyond to get their work done at all hours or all days of the week, but because of the nature of the call center, that flexibility isn't there. So we're continuing to refine our forecasting and bring better performance to that call center. The Federal CARES Act had an impact to us in that there was a provision put into it that permitted, it was a may provision, not a shall, that allowed plan sponsors to offer their members limited access to their defined contribution assets under the fact that if they would self-certify that they met certain criteria due to COVID-19. And so one of the things that they did in all that is normally if you were to take a distribution from your defined contribution plan before you quit working or reach a certain age, you would have to pay a 10% penalty on that. We would be required to withhold 20% of that amount for any potential future tax liability, but both of those were waived. And so, given that the federal government had allowed that flexibility, the governor acted in Executive Order 2021 that allowed us to allow our members to be able to do that because that's not explicitly allowed in Indiana state law. And so as of October 31st, we've had roughly 3,750 withdrawals, averaging about $8,000 each, totaling $30 million that have come out of those DC funds into those members that requested them. So with that, I will stop here. Out of respect for everybody's time, to allow time for questions. I can delve into investments and any other topics depending upon your interest and or time.
Thank you. Representative Porter?
In regards to your
Well, if you're getting into our minority business women, yes, so on slide 62 in the slide deck is a detailed breakout. But today, of our $36 billion under management that was as of the end of last fiscal year, $5 billion of that, which represents 13.8%, were in the hands of minority women business-owned enterprises. I believe it's page 62. And Mr. Porter, we are always open to anyone and any ideas about how we can continue to expand on providing our assets to minority and business women-owned enterprises to the extent that they meet our, fiduciary obligations that we have to our members. Let me see if I can get that readily at hand. If not, I can provide it to you afterwards. It would be in the details of the report, but let me see if I can get to our demographic slides, which start on page 21. So we slide 22 is by status, but I don't see that detailed breakout, but I can get you a breakout of those, Representative Porter, across the teacher plans, those that are active and those that are retired.
Senator Brown?
Quickly, so you said in the beginning you're going to be absorbing the governor. What isn't under?
I'm sorry, Representative Brown, I had a difficult time hearing your question.
I said you mentioned that you are absorbing or adding to IMPERS the governor surviving spouse fund. So what is, which was in under the auditor's office. So what isn't still under IMPERS? What funds are still out there in various departments?
The two known buckets of monies that are out there that we currently don't administer are the state police pension fund and the state deferred compensation.
I'm sorry, the what?
The state deferred compensation, the state's 457. The state police is currently administered by the treasurer, and the deferred compensation is administered by the auditor.
Thank you. Okay, and so it looked like on your slide 21, you have pre-96, 65,000, 25. Is that number next to it? Is that how many are in the plan?
That's correct. Yeah.
And so that older plan, when you said there's no employer rate increase through 2022, right? And so we are 10 billion away from fully funding it in 2038. So when we fund or pay out the 13th check, does that affect the fully funding of that, pushing it out?
No, it doesn't. And what I didn't spend time today is talking about 13th checks and COLAs, because there's been a significant change to how those are funded going forward. There's legislation, I believe it was 2 or 3 sessions ago, that created these things called the SRAs, the Supplemental Reserve Accounts. So in law, essentially, there was accounts put into place that are pre-funded by employers. Those contributions are segregated and put into a fund that's there and dedicated to be able to provide 13th checks or COLAs in the future. And essentially the legislation states that while the General Assembly will set what, if any, 13th checks or COLAs are granted, you can only grant what is available in those accounts that have been set up and pre-funded.
Okay, and with respect to, on page 5, the actuarial valuation of the funds, why is the prosecutor's fund so, because it's top-heavy, but who decides for that one?
So the story on that plan is that it had gotten up to 80% funded back a number of years ago when there was incremental reserves that topped off all of the smaller funds to get them to at least 80%. But shortly after that, the General Assembly granted a series of benefit increases over a number of sessions that then brought that funded status down.
Just for the that's the prosecutors?
That's the prosecutors.
Just for the prosecutors, which brought it down? Said the legislatures added a series of benefits that brought that fund down. So
Correct.
Benefits. Okay.
Yeah, generally speaking, the prosecutors have been seeking to get benefits that are more in line with judges than perf members.
Okay, and then my final question on page 13, when you were talking about the ability under the CARES Act to waive the 20% Fed and the 10% state penalties, 30 million was accessed. Do we know who accessed those dollars? Accessed those 30 million?
Well, our third party who processes and receives all those applications would know who they are. Are you looking for a demographic breakdown of that?
Yes.
I don't have that with me, but I can go get that and provide that to you.
I think it would be interesting to see who accessed that. Yes. No further questions.
Further questions? Any further comments, Mr. Russo?
No, I think for the first time in history, actually finished before I'm supposed to, so I'm going to take it and run.
Thank you. We are now going to pause for the noon hour. We will be back sharply at 1 o'clock to start again. So with that, we're in recess.